people are aware that otherwise then in terms of planning you have a problem, isn't it? If you don't have these discussions continually with the people that are relevant.
No, and that's the norm that we would work with. What I'm pointing to is that if something happens outside of the norm, in our current environment, where you have low growth, limits on revenue, a tight fiscal situation, an expenditure ceiling, and we don't have a limitless access to borrowing and to raising taxes, we've got to look inside this system and see what else can be done. Now, my colleagues will explain to you how the first zero fee increase announcement in December, I think 2015, had to be contended with in our first budget in 2016. And that's an example of, if you like, something that happened on a short-term basis. Now, much of the allocations will still remain in place, but to find the 7 or 8 billion rands during that period meant that we really had to go with a scalpel and start looking for where the meat could come from, so to speak.
Thank you.
The last point, Judge, by way of introduction, is that I think talking to as many of the role players as possible on this particular question, it's quite clear that, as we said in both the State of the Nation address of the President and the budget speech, that we need to enter into a further round of dialogue with all of the key role players, each of whom will have a diversity of solutions to offer. And in that sense, we hope that this is a contribution towards defining a policy roadmap on the one hand, and secondly, a better grasp of where the funding can be obtained within the kind of constraints that we actually have to work with and the competing demands. Our next slide.
Minister, before we move on to the next slide, I just ask you a question around the notion of prioritization. Now, you mentioned that there's a whole chain of documents that have to be taken into account when you approach the whole budgeting process. And you mentioned the NDP being one of the documents that's key in identifying priorities for government. Now, we have before us Professor Makhoba, who's the Deputy Chairperson of the NPC. And he testified that, in his view, the NDP recognizes higher education as a public good and therefore foreshadows the notion of fee-free higher education and training. But he says that he testified that in his view there was a misalignment between what's provided for in the NDP and the budgeting process. And that the budgeting process, or the budget, the product of the budgeting process, didn't properly articulate what is envisaged in the NDP.
In other words, he was saying, in the one document, the NDP, you say, these are our priorities, and when it comes to the budget, you don't find that reflected.
Well, the notion of priorities, with great respect to Dr. Makhoba, is not one which says there's a number 1, 2, 3. A political priority is different from, let's call it, a spending priority. So to say that over time, education and its entire value chain needs to attract as much resources as possible, and my colleagues can give you the numbers in a moment, education does take the largest slice of expenditure. So as a total value chain, it is correct that government is spending the largest amount of money on education. Now, saying that within that higher education should be given a particular kind of treatment is a different proposition, with great respect. The second point is that one can't just jump from an NDP vision of what we would like to see in South Africa by 2030 to today's budgeting. Because if you had Dr. Motsoaledi here to argue the case for national health insurance, By the time he finishes, I can assure you, you'll be convinced that's an equally important, if not more important, priority. If you had invited Mr. Nkunti, the Minister of Rural Development, who chairs the Presidential Infrastructure Coordinating Commission, and Mr. Patel, the Minister of Economic Development here, they will convince you that infrastructure is key to growth, to development, to job creation, and that would generate enough resources in order to fund education or anything else as well. So if one really wants to get a total perspective, then one needs to hear all of these role players, at least half a dozen of them, so that it gives you a balanced picture of, and that's what this slide is about, of all the priorities or challenges that we face, and within that challenging environment, how do you meet each of the challenges? So if there are demands around water and sanitation, for example, assuming that they're spending their money well, which increasingly seems doubtful, then how do you say to people, wait for the water whilst we fund X, Y, and Z, whatever X, Y, and Z might be? So,
well, it must surely be clear that the question of whether fee-free education is feasible depends not upon whether there's a lot of money available or a lot of resources at hand, but in the first instance whether it's regarded as sufficiently important to put it before other priorities. Because the lower down the list one puts it, the less feasible it becomes. Naturally, because there's less money available for it. So feasibility is in the first instance a political decision.
which is a cabinet decision at the end of the day.
Yes, indeed.
We are merely, on the Treasury side, functionaries
No.
who have to say, how do you access money? How do you do your borrowing? How do we explain what the fiscal envelope is that we actually have to work with? And then enter into the appropriate levels of dialogue to balance out the different priorities. That's the only point I'm making. That it's understandable that when one's focus is on a particular area, that appears to be the key area. And the point I'm making as a counter is that if you equally had other people here to say, whilst I understand your focus on higher education, also understand that there are these other needs. And at the end of the day, you can still prioritize education, and it is, as I say, in the budget numbers, as a total value chain. But decision makers are not going to be in a position to ignore certain areas in preference to others. So it's a balancing act, Judge, where prioritization does mean that you attract more resources, but it might not mean that you attract all the resources that are required today or tomorrow. But over time, it's a challenge that can in fact be met.
Minister, you drew a distinction between a political priority and a budgeting priority. Can we just understand who sets the political priorities, who sets the budgeting priorities, and what's the interrelationship between the two?
Well, it's not budgeting priorities. Budgeting is part of the political process as well. So if you sort of go back to the manifesto, the NDP, the MTSF, the individual programs, the various presentations that are made by departments to the Medium-Term Expenditure Committee, which is a technical committee made up of senior officials, the consideration that the Ministers' Committee on the Budget will give to the kind of presentations that are made and the competing demands that we actually have to cope with, and final recommendations that we would make to Cabinet over a period of time, not only on the budgeting priorities, but I suppose the budgeting priority in this case is not about a program. It's about maintaining fiscal credibility and making sure that we have a viable and sustainable fiscal framework at the end of the day. So it's within that process that program priorities might emerge and will emerge, and choices that will have to be made, and resources might have to be diverted from X to Y. But those are processes that take place in these structures that I've actually outlined.
And from a perspective of political prioritization, you mentioned that you have your manifesto, your NDP, your MTS, etc. None of these documents, because they all predated 2015 crisis, none of these documents deal expressly and explicitly with the question of student fees. It deals with increased enrollment and increasing access to higher education and training. But given the fact that there was this clear social disruption in 2015 related to the question of free higher education, when or did the question of providing or increasing access to higher education and eradicating the question of fees, did that come onto the political agenda?
No, it's been there, I think, as a systemic issue, that we've got to improve funding for both higher education, but also for the training part. That I think we should see it as a duality and not neglect one in favor of the other, because ultimately you'll have larger numbers of people and individuals who are in the training side rather than on the tertiary education side. Secondly, my colleagues are in a better position, but once the events of 2015 that you referred to took place, and a political decision was made on the question of zero fee increases, the technical work was done to say, let's go and find, well, firstly, what's going to be the cost of a decision? And that's often missing, by the way, in any political conversation. So generalities abound, and pronouncements, there can be many, but very often they're not accompanied by costing. So if I do X, what will it cost? And secondly, what is it affordable within the kind of framework in which we are currently operating? So it's a discipline that I think more and more needs to be inculcated, so that there's a very direct relationship between a policy proposition or choice, the costing of that choice, and the affordability of the costing that we've engaged in. And then since the 2016 budget, as you can see in the numbers, some 33 billion rands for the next 3 years has been set aside. That's no mean amount, which wasn't there in previous planning processes, that has been set aside. And that is why we emphasize the necessity for a clear roadmap, because that then tells all stakeholders where are we heading, over what kind of period we are looking at, whatever proposition we want to get to. I don't think that yet at the moment we have total agreement on what you call the eradication of fees, because that's a difficult social question as well, which we need to ask. I mean, why can't parents who are willing to pay for their children to have higher education be allowed to pay and make a contribution and thereby lighten the burden on the state? So slogans are one thing. I think we also need to see, as a responsible society and government, what's the right way to go. And that's where the dialogue that's going on at the moment, and the kind of meeting of minds that needs to take place, and the consensus building process becomes quite important. So once we have the policy roadmap clear, we can start indicating what the costing is and what the affordability is.
Minister, you mentioned the responses to the student protests in 2016 and 2017. And indeed, in some instances, you see significant amounts of money being made available by the state for the purposes of higher education as a direct response to the social upheaval and the protests on campuses. And we've had students appear before us who use that to demonstrate that in instances where there is political will, that money can and will be found for the cause of higher education. Do you have a comment on that?
No, we have a political will as a government and as a ruling party to meet all of the social challenges that we have before us, some of which are listed on the slide. Secondly, over the years, we've set aside huge amounts of money as part of the social wage, education, health, housing, and so on. In our latest budget, our calculation is that 2/3 of our expenditure is going towards the social wage. I don't think we necessarily need upheavals to attract funding. There has been a policy shift initiated in, I'm just approximating, but December 2015 or thereabouts, and that policy shift required that new funds be found, and that those funds be found in a very constrained environment. And we've done our best as a government to find those funds and meet some of the immediate needs that we have, whilst at the same time we all acknowledge that we need to do longer term planning. I mean, theoretically it's possible to shut down half the government programs, shift all the money to where social upheavals require it, and nothing stops us from doing that. But is that the responsible thing to do as government? Is a question that all of us will have to ask.